Hello. Welcome to Reading Time. My name's Time, and this week we are reading The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Let's get to reading. The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank is the actual diary of Anne Frank, who was a Jewish girl living in Nazi-occupied Holland during World War II. This diary details events from her life right before and during her time in hiding with her family and some other people. This book also marks our first nonfiction book that we are reviewing on this channel. All of the other books that we have read have been fiction, meaning that they were made up in some regard, but the writing of Anne Frank are really her thoughts and ideas from this time period. Now, even though this book is a diary, and you would think that the diary of a teenage girl wouldn't be something to regard with literary merit, it is still very well written, and it gives details and insights into the mind of a young teenage girl, and I would argue into the minds of a lot of teenage girls, as it deals with ideas of feeling alone and disconnected from family at times, going through changes, and grasping at maturity. And even though Anne was a teenager as she wrote everything in this diary, it is still very well written, and I am going to give it 5 stars. Both because of how well it's written and also because I think that it stands as a significant book in understanding the world's history and how World War II specifically impacted those who lived through it. There is quite a bit of content to be aware of in this book. Now, the content that I am going to be talking about is based off of the definitive edition of the diary. When Anne's diary was originally found after the annex had been raided and all of the occupants had been taken to various labor and concentration camps, Anne's father, Otto Frank, who was the only survivor from that secret annex group, originally published her diary but did not include all of the text and information that she had written. Part of that is because Anne is very blunt about her thoughts on the other members of the annex, including her thoughts and feelings about her mom, whom she did not hold in high regard. In addition, Anne openly talks about sexual matters in her diary, and as such, Otto Frank did not think it was necessarily appropriate to publish that information at that time. Since then, other editions have been published, and the definitive edition, which is the one that is most widely read now, includes all available text from Anne Frank. That being said, I believe that you still can get other editions that have some of this content edited out of it. However, if you are interested in the definitive edition, be aware that there is a good amount of content to be aware of. First off, there is violence apparent in the book, which makes sense as this is happening during World War II. So there are mentions of concentration camps. There are bombings and shootings that the members of the annex can hear as they're in hiding. There are multiple times when the warehouse that they are living over has burglaries that occur. And there's also just discussion of general wartime violence. For substance usage, some of the adults do smoke tobacco and some of the adults also do drink, but this is mentioned in passing usually. Now, the main piece of content that I think surprises a lot of people is the sexual content in this book. Anne is going through puberty during the events of her diary, and as such, she talks about sexual attraction, and at a couple of points in the book, she does talk about female anatomy specifically. She also talks about having interests in a boy who lives in the annex as well, and does talk about some of their first kisses and her attraction for him. She also talks about how she has sexual conversations with him, talking mostly about anatomy specifically and nothing beyond that. But as I said, I do think that a lot of readers are surprised when this content shows up. And so if this is something that you don't want to read, or if you are considering teaching this to an age group that this may not be appropriate content for, I would suggest trying to find an abridged version or finding one of the earlier editions that had some of that content taken out. I also believe that there is a play adaptation that I have seen taught in an 8th grade class before, and I believe a lot of the content was taken out in that adaptation as well. So that is something to consider. Now, generally when I have heard of the Diary of a Young Girl being taught in schools, I actually see it at about the 8th grade age level. And I do think that elements of this diary could very well be discussed at that age, especially since Anne herself would have been right about that age at the beginning of her writings. However, as I just said, if you are going to do it at that age range, I would definitely look for adaptations that don't include all of that sexual content, or I would just look at excerpts of the text. Otherwise, I would suggest this for a high school reading level. Once again, though, I would make sure that you're aware of that content, and it definitely isn't for every reader, but you still can get a lot out of the book, even aside from Anne's musings about these life changes she's going through. Now, this book was especially interesting to me as I was reading it this time through. I actually haven't read it in its fullness before. I've only read excerpts of it as given in school, or as I said previously, I have seen a play adaptation taught in 8th grade during one of my student practicums while I was in college. So it was interesting to me to read this book after the events of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I am by no means trying to compare what people experienced during the pandemic to what Anne Frank would have experienced hiding in the annex for as long as she did. But I do think that in our day and age where students sometimes feel very disconnected from what happened in that era, it can be helpful to try and make connections to their modern lives. For many people during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of isolation. People were at home with their families, sometimes in cramped spaces, and there was some general fear about going out in public to varying degrees. Some people were more worried and some people were less worried. There was a genuine risk to health if you went out and about. And so while this is not the same life experiences by any means, I think students and especially adolescents who lived through the pandemic experienced some of those similar ideas and might be able to make a greater connection to what Anne Frank is saying in her diary, to what she is sharing. Something else I would consider with this book, especially if I were to be teaching it, is the idea of diary writing in general. Writing in a journal detailing one's own life thoughts and experiences can be a very good experience for the writer, but it can also help generations down the line to know these people who lived through these events. Some of what we know today about earlier time periods relies heavily on just what people kept record of. Even the seemingly mundane day-to-day events can be impactful to know about later down the line. And so I think it would be interesting to have students actually try journaling, and whether that is shared out and graded, or if that's more of just a self-reflection piece, and then at the end students discuss what they learned about journaling regularly. That really is up to the teacher, the students, but I think it could be a beneficial exercise in general. It may also help students be a little self-reflective, and maybe they'll find some similarities between themselves and Anne. Now for the poster for this week, we are right near the bottom, right here with that little diary icon. So let me know what you think about the Diary of a Young Girl in the comments below. Have you read this book before? As I said, I had not read the book in its entirety before this point, but I did really enjoy it. I am a fan of historical fiction from around that time period, so it was nice to see a little bit of nonfiction from that time period as well. If you are not already, feel free to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Facebook or Instagram for updates about what I'm reading. Feel free to also offer suggestions for other books that you think that I should read and review, or other book-related content that you would be interested in. And as always, have a marvelous week and a wonderful read.